Donald Trump's CIA director flew into Moscow on an unannounced mission while the administration asked Ukraine to halt strikes near the Russian capital. That combination matters because Washington has not publicly explained what John Ratcliffe was sent there to negotiate or what Moscow may have been offered. And while that mystery unfolds, Trump is simultaneously escalating economic fights with Canada and threatening countries that continue doing business with Iran. So the question is not simply why the CIA director went to Moscow, it is whether these moves fit together into a foreign policy strategy Americans can actually identify, and what the contradictions tell us when the administration will not. Start with what we can establish. John Ratcliffe traveled to Moscow for meetings with Russian officials. A United States Air Force C-17 Globemaster flew from the Washington area, stopped in Riga, Latvia, and then landed at Moscow's Vnukovo Airport. Video from Moscow showed a motorcade that included vehicles with American diplomatic plates. This was not a routine public diplomatic visit. The trip had not been announced in advance, and American agencies declined to publicly explain its purpose. That establishes Ratcliffe's presence. It does not establish that he met Vladimir Putin personally, nor does it establish the terms of whatever discussions took place. Those details matter because speculation is already moving faster than the confirmed record. But there is another fact that gives the trip much more significance. Before Ratcliffe's visit, the United States asked Ukraine to temporarily suspend drone and missile attacks against Moscow and other cities in northern Russia. Ukraine was reportedly informed that a senior American official would be traveling to Russia. That provides a straightforward security explanation for at least part of the request. If a senior United States official is physically inside Moscow, Washington obviously has an interest in preventing an American official from being caught anywhere near a Ukrainian strike. But that explanation only answers the immediate security question. It does not answer the political one. Why was the director of the CIA traveling to Moscow in the first place? Ratcliffe is not simply another diplomatic envoy. He leads the American intelligence agency responsible for collecting foreign intelligence and assessing threats to the United States. Sending someone in that position directly into Russia during an active war involving a country backed by Washington carries a different political signal than a routine embassy meeting, and the timing makes the signal even harder to ignore. Ukraine has intensified long-range operations inside Russia. Russia, meanwhile, has continued drone and missile attacks against Ukrainian cities. Washington is therefore dealing with two competing objectives: maintaining leverage over Moscow while trying to prevent an uncontrolled escalation. That creates the strongest reasonable explanation for Ratcliffe's trip. Secret diplomacy is not automatically suspicious. Presidents routinely use intelligence officials and back channels when public negotiations become impossible. William Burns, Ratcliffe's predecessor at the CIA, traveled to Moscow in 2021 as Russian forces were massing near Ukraine. Intelligence chiefs can communicate warnings, negotiate sensitive matters, discuss prisoners, establish deconfliction channels, or carry messages that governments do not want negotiated through microphones. So Ratcliffe going to Moscow does not by itself prove Trump is capitulating to Putin, but accepting that defense creates another test. What is the administration asking from Russia in return? Because while Ukraine was being asked to restrict operations during this visit, Americans still do not know whether Moscow was being asked to make any comparable concession. Was Ratcliffe discussing a temporary limitation on strikes, prisoners, energy infrastructure, a ceasefire framework, intelligence matters, something entirely different? Until those terms become public, anyone claiming to know the complete answer is getting ahead of the evidence. And that distinction is important because Trump's public posture toward adversaries is currently much louder than the diplomacy happening behind closed doors. The administration has threatened severe secondary economic consequences against countries doing business with Iran. China has responded publicly that it opposes unilateral sanctions without United Nations Security Council authorization and intends to protect what it describes as lawful commercial relations with Iran. Think about the contradiction Washington now has to manage. Trump wants economic pressure powerful enough to make countries reconsider their relationships with Iran, but several of the governments Washington would need to pressure, including China and Russia, are major geopolitical powers with their own leverage over the United States. Threatening them is easy. Making them comply is the test. China's response is evidence that at least one major target is not publicly backing down. Beijing says its cooperation with Iran will continue within what it considers the framework of international law. That means secondary sanctions create a choice for Washington: enforce them aggressively and risk widening the economic confrontation with China and potentially Russia. Enforce them selectively and undermine the credibility of the threat. That is the first major strategic problem. The second is happening much closer to home. While Ratcliffe was in Moscow and Washington was confronting governments doing business with Iran, Trump escalated his rhetoric against Canada, including floating the idea of renaming Lake Ontario Lake America. Forget the name for a moment. Look at the money. Canada announced that beginning September 8th, it will impose retaliatory tariffs on approximately 27.6 billion Canadian dollars of American imports. The rates will range from 15 to 50% across roughly 700 products. Those are not social media posts. Those are scheduled trade measures. Canada says its retaliation will match the new American tariffs, dollar for dollar and rate for rate. The targeted sectors include steel, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, and electronics. And this is where a political fight becomes something you can potentially see in a paycheck, an order book, a factory schedule, or a household budget. Tariffs are collected at the border, but the economic burden does not magically remain there. Importers can absorb some of the cost, suppliers can cut margins, currencies can adjust, buyers can switch products, or businesses can pass costs downstream. Retaliatory tariffs can also make American products less competitive inside Canada. That matters because Canada is not some distant economic adversary. American and Canadian supply chains are deeply integrated, particularly in manufacturing, autos, energy, and agriculture. Components can cross the border during production. Businesses on one side sell directly to consumers, and companies on the other. So when Washington taxes Canadian goods and Ottawa retaliates against American goods, the political headline is America versus Canada. The economic reality can be American companies paying for both sides of the confrontation. Here is the standard worth applying. If a tariff policy is supposed to strengthen American producers, how much weight should we give the stated intention compared with the documented retaliation those producers now face? Because Canada has already supplied a measurable answer to part of that question. 700 categories of American products are about to face new barriers. And there is a reason incomplete political claims work so well. You hear the tariff percentage or the trade deficit, but not the retaliation, supply chain, denominator, or who actually pays at the border. That is how reasonable people end up repeating weak arguments and putting their own credibility behind them. Don't Get Played gives you a repeatable way to catch that. The digital ebook is $9 one time. Use the first link in the description or pinned comment. Now look at the number Trump keeps emphasizing, the trade deficit. Trump has repeatedly portrayed a bilateral trade deficit as evidence that another country is taking advantage of the United States. But a trade deficit is not a bill Canada sends Washington. It means Americans purchase more goods and services from Canada than Canadians purchase from the United States during the measured period. Whether that is economically harmful depends on what is being purchased, why, and what happens elsewhere in the economy. Canada supplies the United States with significant amounts of energy and raw materials. If an American refinery buys Canadian crude oil, that purchase can increase the bilateral goods deficit, while simultaneously supplying an American business with an input it needs. So simply pointing to a deficit does not prove exploitation. The dairy tariff argument requires context too. Canadian dairy protections can impose extremely high tariffs on imports above specified quota levels. That is real, but presenting the highest above quota tariff as though every American agricultural product entering Canada routinely pays that rate creates a misleading picture of how the system works. That distinction does not mean Canada has no protectionist policies. It does. It means the argument has to survive its own details, and Canada's response now raises a politically uncomfortable question for Republican lawmakers representing states that depend heavily on cross-border trade. If the parties were reversed and a Democratic president triggered Canadian retaliation against hundreds of categories of American goods while arguing that the pain would eventually produce a better agreement, how much temporary economic damage would Republicans consider acceptable? That is not a partisan trick. It is a consistency test. Now add the polling environment. A Reuters/Ipsos survey released this week puts Trump's overall job approval at 33%, matching a record low in that polling series. Support for the war with Iran has also declined, with 31% of Americans supporting the military action in that survey. That number matters because foreign policy is no longer isolated from domestic economics. energy disruptions, military commitments, sanctions, and trade conflicts eventually converge at the same place: the voters' perception of whether the government is making life safer, more affordable, and more predictable. And the Reuters/Ipsos poll found something else worth noticing. A large majority of respondents expect the Iran conflict to last an extended period. That makes Trump's foreign policy challenge much harder. A president can sometimes absorb the political cost of a short conflict if voters believe the objective is clear and the result is decisive. A prolonged conflict combined with economic disruption requires something else: confidence. Confidence that the strategy has an achievable objective. Confidence that allies understand the plan. Confidence that adversaries believe American threats, and confidence that the administration's public claims correspond to observable reality. That is why the Moscow trip matters beyond John Radcliffe. The issue is not whether talking to Russia is inherently wrong. Talking to an adversary can be responsible statecraft. The issue is leverage. If Washington temporarily restrains Ukraine while opening a channel with Moscow, what does Washington receive from Moscow? If Trump threatens countries that trade with Iran, which countries actually change their behavior? If tariffs are supposed to force Canada into better terms, what happens when Canada responds with equivalent tariffs instead? Those questions all measure the same thing: whether presidential pressure produces concessions or merely produces counterpressure. Canada has chosen counterpressure. China has publicly chosen resistance. Russia's side of the Radcliffe discussion remains largely hidden. And North Korea provides another example of the limits of personal diplomacy. Trump has continued emphasizing his relationship with Kim Jong-un while signaling opposition to certain United States-South Korea military exercises. But Pyongyang has not publicly rewarded those gestures with the kind of diplomatic breakthrough Trump appears to want. That does not mean engagement with North Korea should stop. Diplomacy is often preferable to military escalation. It means personal rapport is not the same thing as strategic leverage. A photograph with a foreign leader is not a concession. A flattering statement is not an agreement, and a private meeting is not a victory until we know what changed because of it. This is where the Radcliffe mission becomes the most consequential, unresolved piece of the story. We know the CIA director went to Moscow. We know an American military transport aircraft made the unusual journey. We know Ukraine was asked to pause certain strikes while a senior American official traveled inside Russia. What we still do not know publicly is the exact purpose of Radcliffe's meetings, everyone he met, what he requested, what Russia requested, and whether any agreement resulted. Those unknowns should limit the conclusion. There is not enough evidence to say Radcliffe's trip proves Trump surrendered American interests to Putin. There is also not enough public information to treat the mission as a diplomatic success. The responsible conclusion sits between those claims. Trump's administration is simultaneously pursuing private engagement with Russia, economic confrontation with Iran's trading partners, and an escalating trade fight with Canada. Each strategy depends on American leverage. And in every case, the relevant test is not the intensity of Trump's language. It is the behavior Washington can actually produce from another government. With Canada, we already have a result: retaliation covering 27.6 billion Canadian dollars in American imports beginning September 8th. With China, we have a public refusal to accept Washington's sanctions framework. With Russia, we have an unexplained high-level intelligence mission whose outcome remains unknown. And with American voters, we have a president sitting at 33% approval in the latest Reuters/Ipsos survey, while support for the Iran war declines. Those are four different pieces of evidence pointing toward the same political vulnerability. Trump has built much of his foreign policy image around the idea that unpredictability and maximum pressure force other governments to yield. But maximum pressure only works if the other side believes refusing will cost more than complying. Canada is betting it can retaliate. China is signaling it can resist. Russia is willing to talk privately, but we do not yet know what it is willing to give. That is the contradiction we started with. The CIA director's Moscow visit may ultimately produce something useful. If it reduces attacks, advances negotiations, frees prisoners, establishes a ceasefire mechanism, or produces a verifiable Russian concession, that result should be judged on its merits. But until that evidence exists, the trip should not be converted into either a triumph or a betrayal. The administration possesses the authority to conduct sensitive diplomacy. It also bears responsibility for explaining the resulting policy once disclosure no longer threatens the mission. Meanwhile, the consequences we can already measure are economic and political. Canadian retaliation is scheduled, China is publicly rejecting Washington's pressure, and Trump's approval remains at a record low in Reuters/Ipsos polling. What happens next will tell us whether these confrontations produce agreements or simply additional confrontations. And another political clip, poll, accusation, filing, or official explanation, will soon ask you to decide before all the evidence is visible. Don't get played is a practical method for becoming harder to manipulate and better able to defend your political convictions with evidence. It's a digital ebook for $9 one time. The first link is in the description or pinned comment. Reacting is easy, reaching a conclusion you can defend is harder.